Chapter 15, The Ferment of Reform and Culture, 1790 to 1860. I think I told you guys before that this is by far my least favorite chapter of the book. There's just tons of religious figures, literary figures, artistic figures, and yeah, there's a chance that they could be on the AP test, but you shouldn't stress yourself, and I try and point out the most important ones and the most heavily hit ones. And this chapter just tends to be boring stuff, so bear with us. Okay, so the thing you got to know really about this chapter is at its core, everything stems from the Great Awakening. So what is the Great Awakening? It's a religious revivalism. It's a spiritual reform from within. And we talked about that there's at least two Great Awakenings, religious Great Awakenings in our nation's history. The first one happens in the 1730s. That's where you got Jonathan Edwards and all that fire and brimstone stuff. This one is a much more happy God, much kinder, gentler type of God, and it really sparks the first. I don't want to call them TV evangelists because they don't have TVs back then, but they were essentially the same things. These guys would tour around the country and preach in a very colorful way and very exciting way, and you'd have these like almost like fairs or fests, like a religious fest, and people would camp out and hear this guy talk. So you get a lot of evangelism, and it branches out and it manifests itself in some other stuff besides religion. Right? It creates a bunch of social reforms, and it forces people to redefine what a utopia is, redefine what paradise is, start thinking about equality as far as not just rich and poor, but men and women and with the races as well, because this really forms the ethical basis of the abolitionist movement, which we're going to read a lot about next chapter. Temperance. You start to see the first anti-alcohol groups form during this time period. And they keep pushing until they're eventually successful with the Prohibition Amendment in the first quarter of the 20th century. Asylum and penal reform. Prior to this, if you were crazy, you were viewed as, touched by the devil, perhaps. And so you were thrown into prison. You wouldn't get any type of treatment whatsoever. If your family couldn't take care of you, you were thrown in basically a cage, and you were left there until you died, maybe decades later. It was a horrible existence. Same thing with prisons. You were just thrown in a cage. And so the whole idea of rehabilitation, of fixing what is wrong with you mentally or soulfully, and fixing that aspect so that you can go back out into society. Abolitionism, we already talked about that, and we're going to talk much more about it next chapter. It's the anti-slavery movement really gains traction during this time period. Women's rights. The first feminist movement, really, the modern feminist movement, starts during this time period in Seneca Falls, and they become big proponents of all of these different causes. This Second Great Awakening and all these reform movements are really driven by females. It really is a woman's type movement, and so they're also looking for their own rights as well. And lastly, education. We talked in class that there was really no education outside of the home prior to this time period, and this all changes. By 1860, every single state has some form of free public education, and we're going to talk about why that occurs. So we start with religion itself, and there's a couple theories on, I guess it's still Christianity, and it was a lot of our founding fathers, including Thomas Jefferson, believed in this idea of deism, and that's that you should read the Bible with a grain of salt, and all of the stories that are told in the Bible perhaps are symbolic as opposed to 100% factual. And so this whole concept of original sin they thought was bunk. They also thought that perhaps Jesus Christ, although he was a man, he was just a man. He was not a God. However, deists do believe in God. Now, they also tend to be Unitarians. There's a Unitarian faith that believes that God exists, or at least some supreme being exists, but they only think it's one person, not the Trinity, so not the Holy Spirit or Jesus the Son. So that's what they mean by Unitarian, meaning one. They believe in one God, not the three. So you can see how this is a departure from most of the Protestant faiths and definitely Catholicism. However, they still believe in God and they still believe in the moral principles of the Bible. They still believe in an afterlife and all that type of stuff. So it's not a huge departure, but this is kind of an Enlightenment twist to traditional Christian faith, and that takes a lot of this Great Awakening. Um, it spawns so many different Protestant faiths, especially the evangelical faiths, and spawns so much more just individual interpretation in the Bible as opposed to getting the the cold stone truth from some religious authority. This is an example of one of these revival camps. You can see here, this is the period before they had speakers and stuff like that. So you all gather around in almost like a theater type setting. Here you can see the tents in the background and everybody here, and they're all having miracles supposedly performed, and the sick are being healed, and this guy's a very bold, powerful speaker and stuff like that. But these camps were just, once you got out of the main religious part, they just turned into be drunken fests. There's a famous murder case that Abraham Lincoln was the defense attorney for one of these religious revival camps that set up in mid-state Illinois during this time period. So all was not as the book projects it, where you just have tons of holy rollers. This was entertainment at the end of the day. Right? People were bored, they believed in God, and yet now you have this exciting, speaker and all these supposed miracles. It's kind of like a magician's act combined with a lot of fiery speech, and in the shadows, a lot of drunkenness, and further in the shadows, I wouldn't be surprised if some ladies of the evening were plying their trade. One of the most famous evangelists of this time period was Charles Finney. He had a several decade career where he toured the country, um, spreading the word. Okay, the Mormons. I only have one or two slides here with the Mormons because you can get the information on their history and their faith in so many other places, and we're going to cover it in class also. What you have to know is there's a whole group, a whole series of utopian communities where you have these very charismatic leaders, these founders, and they have a very kind of kooky, we'll say, beliefs compared to the traditional Christian norms. And Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormons, and his lieutenant, the guy who ends up saving them, Brigham Young, are no different. We'll go over the history in class, but you have to know that they believed in polygamy, and they believed that Jesus Christ appeared to the Indians and basically wrote a whole new section of the Bible, and they were persecuted. Now, they also kept engaging in savings and loan fraud everywhere they went, so they were tended to be persecuted by the people who loaned them money. So is that a true persecution, or is that just a creditor seeking his legal debts? But who knows? Eventually, Joseph Smith is killed. He's murdered, and so Brigham Young decides, let's just take all of the Mormons and move to the wilderness. And so they tried to figure a place where America would never get to, and that was the Rocky Mountains, the arid desert Rocky Mountains, and they would call this thing the State of Desiree. You can see it right here. And here at Salt Lake City is where they founded their capital, and they basically were able to practice their Mormon faith without U.S. government interference for a couple decades until the westward migration, right, catches up with them, and then eventually they're forced to give up their polygamy and other, kooky rules in order to be admitted into the country as a state pretty late into the 1800s. Now we're going to switch to education. we've already talked before about Republican motherhood, and that it was the role of the mother in the aftermath of the Revolutionary War to raise her sons in civics with reading, writing, and democratic principles, so they could be the future leaders of America. With the exception of some seminary colleges, that was pretty much it for education in America. So if you were a kid or a teenager, there just wasn't any formal schooling going around. And this starts to change. We talked about in the Northwest Ordinance where they would sell a certain plot of land every 1/16 of a mile, I believe, to fund public education. By 1860, every single state has some form of free public education. Now, we're not talking the type of public schools or even private schools like you see today, where you're in school for over 180 days, 9 months a year, from 8 to 3 p.m. You just don't see that. These schools tended to be just one-room schoolhouses with one teacher, and basically every kid in the village would go into this one-room schoolhouse, and you had a lot of independent learning, and they perhaps would only be around for 3-4 months of the year when their chores, their factory work, or definitely their agricultural work allowed it. And they didn't take attendance or anything like that. And so they kept the curriculum was basically learn how to read, learn how to write, and learn how to do simple math. That was the stuff that you did. And if you wanted anything more than that, you had to be, wealthy. And your parents would actually hire a private tutor who would come into the house, oftentimes living in the house, and privately educate the children. And then once you became in your late teens, then you could go to one of the many, at this point, colleges and universities across the country, and that's where you would get the more advanced education. This all, the process of public education, really, he's not the founder, but he's considered to be the father of education, is Horace Mann. And it was his theory or his philosophy that there were no bad kids, that you could, basically mold a kid like clay. And if you had good teachers and school officials and a good plan, that you could create good citizens and teach people what they needed to know. So children should be molded to a state of perfection. He was against corporal punishment. However, it was very common in these one-room schoolhouses to beat the ever-living crap out of a kid with a stick or a paddle. You could also make fun of kids and stick them in the corner and stick a dunce hat on them and call them idiots and stuff like that. It was very common to do that type of stuff in school, although Horace Mann was against it. He also starts several teacher training programs, around the country. Prior to this, there was no formal education or license to become a teacher, and so you got a lot of really crappy teachers who, barely knew more than their students, if at all. Although I've come across some individuals who will fall into that today. What are they studying in these one-room schoolhouses? Almost everybody had one of these McGuffey readers. This was the textbook of the 1800s and even into the 1900s to a certain extent. And so what is it? It's basically just think Republican motherhood type stuff. It tries to teach American values, and it uses a lot of religious ideology as well, but you get a heavy dose of American virtue, American civics, uh, and the way to teach spelling and stuff like that. Teach middle class morality and respect for order. Zinn would have a field day with the McGuffey readers, and basically it's a brainwashing of the middle class and the lower class, although the lower class probably aren't going to school. You're brainwashing the middle class to respect the wealthy class, to not make waves, stuff like that. And I told you already, teach the 3 R's, plus the Protestant ethic. And what is the Protestant ethic? Frugality, which means waste not, want not, hard work, and sobriety. This is a picture from your book about what the one-room schoolhouse looked like. You can see here you would have basically a stove. You would have the teacher in the middle. This depiction here is probably a little inaccurate because most of the teachers during this time period were actually men. It doesn't really change into a female-dominated profession at the lower levels until the latter half of the 1800s. But the first part of the 1800s, it was almost exclusively a male-dominated profession. And you can see the kids of different ages here. You got the real little kids, you get the big kids over here in middle school, and they're all kind of, reading and working on their McGuffey readers, just individually. And the teacher would go around and beat the hell out of kids that were misbehaving or talking and stuff like that. Okay, Dorothea Dix. This lady was instrumental in reforming primarily insane asylums, but also the penal system, so penitentiaries and jails and stuff like that. Apparently she was this real small, kind of thin, sickly, obviously ugly woman, and she would go around the country and just write notes. She would, get into these insane asylums and prisons and just copy down on paper what she saw. And so she got a lot of access because she wasn't making waves. And once she did this, she made reports, and she published these reports. And she submitted these reports to the government and talked about all the horrific things that were going on in these insane asylums and penitentiaries, which were basically just like cages, right? And dirt floors, and the food was just left in there, but that was it. Sometimes the mentally handicapped were shackled to the wall, and all this just horrible, like kind of like horror movie type stuff. And as a result of her muckraking, I'm going to use a term that is used a few chapters from now, but as a result of her muckraking, she's able to improve the conditions of a lot of these insane asylums, improve the conditions of a lot of these penitentiaries, so that they actually try and care for the individual, try and treat the individual like a patient, as opposed to someone who's got a demon inside of them or something like that. So she's tested a lot. So know the name Dorothea Dix in regards to insane asylums and penitentiaries. Okay, speaking of women, we've gone over this a lot, especially when we talked about the Lowell textile mills last chapter. The whole separate spheres concept, and it plays into the cult of domesticity. Another way of calling it is the cult of true womanhood, and it's kind of the evolution from Republican motherhood. And it goes like this. In colonial times, men and women did not have separate spheres. Women were still considered to be second-class citizens, right? They couldn't own property, they couldn't vote, all this other stuff. But they're working usually with their husband or father or brother out in the field, right? Giving birth to cows and help feeding the pigs and plowing the fields. They're basically doing the exact same thing that the men are doing. And then at night they're, fixing the clothing and all this other stuff. Well, with the rise of the factory system, with the Industrial Revolution, it really is, with the exception of the Lowell textile mills, only men who are going to the factories. The women are staying at home. So they have two totally separate spheres then. Men are at the factory, that's their sphere, and women stay at home, that's their sphere. And their job was to create this idyllic place of refuge for the man. So the man goes and works in the factory, and he's suffering from exhaustion and physical ailments and health problems because these factories are dirty and dangerous and all this other stuff. He's probably working there for 12, 16 hours a day. He comes home, and the idea under a cult of domesticity is that this house now is a clean, happy, safe place where he can have a hot meal waiting for him and a drink and a pipe, and it's nice and quiet, or it's real happy and people are, the kids and the wife are maybe singing and playing music, so he can just kind of unwind and veg out until it's time to pass out and then go back to work the next day. Women were also seen as much more pious and much more, pure, and so it was their role to civilize the husband, who's stronger but more prone to perhaps stray from God a little bit, especially at work, because he hates life, and so she's supposed to fix this at his time at home. So a minister from Massachusetts in the 1830s apparently said, "The power of woman is her dependence. A woman who gives up that dependence on man to become a reformer yields the power God has given her for her protection, and her character becomes unnatural." So God has bequeathed to women her servility to man. Lucky her. So the early 19th century woman was unable to vote, had the legal status of a minor. If she was single, she could own her own property. If she was married, she did not get to own her own property. And she had no control over her children, too. So if the husband left, he got the kids. Very different from today. The woman could not initiate a divorce. So if she was in a violent or loveless marriage, she stuck. She couldn't make wills. She couldn't sign a contract. And she couldn't sue somebody unless she had her husband's permission. So you can see the cult of domesticity really takes away, any sort of power at all from the woman. Basically, her job was just to spit out a bunch of kids, cook, clean, and as your book states, show her prowess in flower arranging. And for the feminists who spoke out against this, and we're going to talk about them soon, this would be a derogatory cartoon. It says what it would be like if ladies had their own way. Look at, God forbid, they would drive a carriage. And in response, what the men would be forced to do, but care for the children and do laundry. Perish the thought. So a lot of women, again, we got some uggos down here. A lot of women fought this. And so something that you see tested all the time is the start of the modern women's rights movement, or the feminist movement. And it starts in 1848 at Seneca Falls, New York. It was called the Women's Rights Convention. So think about it, they tried to have it, geared towards and mimic all of the other constitutional conventions that America had beforehand. So they drew up a list of grievances. They called them declarations. And they declared that women should have the right to vote, that they should have the chance to sue people and have property and all this other stuff that we just talked about the last slide. You don't have to really know any of that type of stuff. You just have to know that the women's movement starts in 1848 at Seneca Falls. That's going to be good enough. Nothing really happens, right? Even though they're oftentimes successful in the abolitionist movement, do they end up getting the right to vote with the Civil War amendments? No, and that dealt them a blow. Then throughout the Gilded Age, which is the aftermath of the Civil War, do they really have any rights? No. In fact, many of them are pushed into the factories, and yet they still have all of the penalties of being a woman. In the early 20th century, do they have any rights? No. They don't finally get the right to vote until 1919, 1920, somewhere around there. And they're still persecuted in the workplace and legally, for several more decades. And it's not really until the 1960s where women are, able to make a lot of legal and workplace gains. And really, the glass ceiling still exists, right? We've never had a female president, and if you look at salaries today, for the same type of job, a man typically makes significantly more than a woman. So, two of the early feminists that you need to know are pictured right there. There's Elizabeth Cady Stanton on the left. She's the white-haired one. And Susan B. Anthony, who's probably the most famous, is right there on the right there. I showed you this picture. All right, wilderness utopias. I like to think of these as basically the same as the Mormons, right? I mean, at the end of the day, that's what the Mormons were doing, was they were creating a religious utopia. And I mean, the Mormons really did believe in this notion of heading out in the wilderness to do this. All of these religious utopias, you can also kind of trace their roots back to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, where you have John Winthrop and his city on a hill trying to create this idyllic, perfect religious group of like-minded individuals They thought that they could purify, right, the earth and create a communal system of worshiping God in their own freaky way. So the Mormons we briefly talked about already, and then there's these two, the polar opposites from each other. The most interesting one is probably the Oneida community, and you can see there the founder is John Humphrey Noyes, and they were, I call them 19th century hippies, because it was just a commune. They practiced free love, so there was no such thing as marriage. People, men and women, were screwing each other left and right. Lots of women, lots of men. They're basically having big group type activities. They practiced birth control, which is a big no-no back in the 19th century. I won't get into the type of birth control. And another freaky thing that they did is they engaged in eugenics, which is it's a very kind of socially no-no. We're going to talk about it in greater detail in the 20th century. This is the type of stuff that Hitler was into, where he believed in the master race, and so he tried to breed what he believed the master race together to create like this pure-blooded Aryan BS. Well, the Oneida community was also doing the same thing. Had nothing to do with the Aryan race and stuff like that, but they were trying to create what they thought was the future, leaders of their community. They were around for decades. I mean, they were doing this for most of the 1800s, and they were looked at as weirdos by just about everybody back then and now. Here's the funny thing. The Oneida community just recently, in the last couple of years, declared bankruptcy. Now, they had given up their freaky stuff a long time ago, and in the late 1800s, they actually just became a typical corporation. And what were they making? Silverware. And so I would ask you, you should go in your kitchen right now, and you should look at the back of your forks and your spoons and stuff like that, and I bet a ton of you see the word Oneida on there, because until the Chinese started selling silverware about a decade ago, Oneida silverware had the largest market share out of any silverware in the country, and they had done so because they had been around forever. So if you have yourself an Oneida spoon, I would advise you to wash that very, very good, because you don't know what type of freaky stuff that they were doing with that spoon back when they made it at the Oneida farm. Now, the polar opposite of the Oneida community were the Shakers. The Shakers actually start in Europe, and they start several kind of satellite offshoots here in America, but they had just the opposite belief. They believed in total lack of any sort of sexual connection whatsoever. So they were anti-marriage, and they were definitely anti-sex. So they couldn't be any more different than the Oneidas. Now, with these Oneidas, though, if they're having sex left and right, they're making kids, right, despite their various birth control methods. So you're creating new Oneida members. These Shakers, on the other hand, if they're so closeted and so harsh in their sexual rules, where you're never allowed to have sex, you're supposed to deny yourself of any sort of procreation, you're having a hard time replacing dead Shakers, if you know what I mean. So they kind of cease to exist fairly quickly, and their only converts are recruits that they can pull in. Look at how freaky this John Noyes is. No wonder this guy was preaching free love. Who the hell would sleep with this guy just of their own volition? This is Mansion House, so this is the main place in the Oneida community where all of the hippies lived. You can see it's a fairly nice mansion, so it's good duds, as long as you're into the stuff that goes on in the mansion house when the lights go out. There's a group of ladies in the Oneida community, and some dudes, who are, I don't know what they're doing right there, but this is a typical day in the Oneida community of just hanging out. I think they're sewing bags or something like that to sell. And then again, God knows what they do once the cameras go off. Okay, art. There's only one thing you ever see tested on the AP test as far as American art, and that's called the Hudson River School of Art. They before the Hudson River School, the main type of art in America were portraits, right? You saw those portraits of John Adams and George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, stuff like that. That's what people were doing. This changes in the style of art, the focus, the popularity of art changes to pastoral settings where someone would set up an easel on a cliff or over a nice hill and basically paint, a cool landscape. And so this is an example of it. It's called the Hudson River School of Art because a lot of people set up on the Hudson River in upstate and downstate New York and painted what they saw. So just remember that. Okay, literature. There's a ton of stuff to cover here, and yet it's almost never tested. It's never tested in APUS history. However, your English teacher, punishes you, tortures you by having you read these darn novels throughout your high school career, and even some of your college professors are going to force you to read this crap. For the most part, I've read all of these books, and I've only liked a few of them. The Last of the Mohicans was a good book. The style of literature during this time period is Romanticism, and I have here it emphasizes imagination over reason, nature over civilization, intuition over calculation, the self over society. It's really focused on emotion and the individual as opposed to any sort of Enlightenment era type analysis. Those were all like political treaties and stuff like that. Treatises, I should say. So the first couple American authors you have to know about are Washington Irving. He's the guy who wrote Rip Van Winkle and Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And James Fenimore Cooper, who wrote The Last of the Mohicans. Okay, Transcendentalism, which sucks. I hate Transcendentalism. I feel like if he was still alive during this time period, Thomas Jefferson would probably be a Transcendentalist, and I hate him too. So I put in the same category of the wall of shame of American history, I put Thomas Jefferson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Henry David Thoreau. They're all crap in my mind. So they believed in liberation from understanding and the cultivation of reasoning. There's a lot of just namby-pamby BS, if you ask me. They want to transcend the limits of intellect and allow the emotions, the soul, to create an original relationship with the universe. It's a very selfish. They think that everybody's special, and they think that everybody has this like divine inspired enlightenment within them. I've taught a lot of idiots in my day, and there was nothing special about many of them, and there's nothing divine about many of them. So man must acknowledge a body of moral truths that were intuitive and must transcend more sensational proof. The infinite benevolence of God, the infinite benevolence of nature, the divinity of man. And as a result, they reject all secular authority and all church authority, all scriptures, all law, all conventions. It's all about me, 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 me. This is, we have a lot of sayings here, right? For the football program here at Carmel, we say it's a we thing, it's not a me thing. Well, the Transcendentalists, they're all about me. For the baseball program, we say it's all about team, and we ask our players to put the team first, perhaps their personal achievements and statistics second. No, the Transcendentalists, you're up there taking your hacks. You're going to hit a home run or you're going to strike out. To hell with the score. That's what Transcendentalist type of thinking, that the individual is supreme. To hell with the rest of you. So I hate that type of thinking. Therefore, if man was divine, it would be wicked that he should be held in slavery, or his soul corrupted by superstition, or his mind clouded by ignorance. Okay, well, on the slavery thing, sure, I agree that slavery is bad, but it has nothing to do with man being divine. Perhaps it's just wrong to enslave another individual. Ignorance, in my mind, is Transcendentalism. It's the ignorance and the primacy of the individual. Thus, the role of the reformer was to restore man to that divinity which God had endowed them. I think it's so selfish, too. So you have these guys like Thoreau and Emerson who are talking about how important they are, how great they are, and then all they do is diss everybody else. Doesn't it seem counterintuitive or circular reasoning? Perhaps everybody else should talk about how great they are. All right, so here are these jerks right here. There's Ralph Waldo Emerson, the useless crap that he wrote. There's Henry David Thoreau, and the useless crap that he wrote. Now, I love that my favorite story is Thoreau, where he gets arrested and he's in jail, right? And then when it was all because he was defying the government. It was his act of civil disobedience. So, what a martyr Henry David Thoreau is, to go to jail for something that he believed in. And when Ralph Waldo Emerson came and visited him, and he said, "What are you doing in here?" Henry David Thoreau said, "What are you doing out there?" Ooh, snap. All right, well, here's the truth. Henry David Thoreau didn't pay, I believe it was a $1 poll tax to vote. He goes to jail for 1 day before somebody else pays the poll tax for him. He spent 1 day in jail and then writes this big, self-aggrandizing treatise on why he's such a martyr to commit civil disobedience versus the government. Their agenda. Their agenda is not too bad, I have to admit. It's just their philosophy behind it is completely out of whack. So they're anti-slave, nothing wrong there. Give well-being to the poor and the miserable, nothing wrong there. Give learning to the ignorant. Now, it's learning according to the Transcendentalists. So it's not just teaching the 3 R's, it's teaching this BS about Transcendentalism. And give health to the sick, no problem there. Give peace and justice to society, nothing wrong there. All right. Unfortunately, nowadays, there are no critics besides me to the Transcendentalists. You'll see, I'm sure your English teacher loves them. Every professor you have loves them. They just kind of get brainwashed by all this Transcendentalist BS. But during the 1800s, at least, there were some critics to the Transcendentalists, and my guy Nathaniel Hawthorne was one of them. And his response is basically, you got to accept that the world is an imperfect place and that there are bad people who live there and they're going to do bad things. And sometimes you got to get your fingers dirty. And if you need to make money by working in a factory or owning a factory, yeah, you're going to kill some plants and the random fish and beaver are going to die to make some money and to provide a better life for not just your family, but for perhaps the town, which apparently for the Transcendentalists, they were against towns as well. They thought everybody should live in a wooden shack alone in the middle of the woods. All right, other literary individualists and dissenters that you need to know about. Louisa May Alcott, she wrote Little Women, which is an awful book and an even worse movie. Emily Dickinson, she wrote a bunch of poems where she just complained about being a girl and just boring girl stuff. Edgar Allan Poe, he's the man. He wrote a bunch of short stories. He's kind of like the first horror writer in American history, and they're good too. They hold up over time. So the Cask of Amontillado is one of my favorites. You can read the Raven. There's the House of Gables. I mean, there's just a ton of cool, scary short stories that he wrote, and lots of revenge themes and paying for past crimes. It's good stuff. We already talked about Nathaniel Hawthorne, who wrote The Scarlet Letter. I read that one too. It's long. It's not as boring as some of the, Little Women, Emily Dickinson type stuff. But it talks about there's this woman who she had premarital sex, and so she had to wear a scarlet letter on her dress, and all the adventures she has as a result of that. And then there's Herman Melville, who writes Moby Dick, and nobody liked it when Melville was alive, and unfortunately people like it now that he's dead, because if you ever are forced to read that book, you will want to die as well. This is the last slide. It just gives you a nice chronology of all the stuff that happens during this time period. So you can see I left out a lot of stuff from the chapter, and it's stuff that I have not seen on the AP test. Now, on a typical AP test, you'll oftentimes see just questions come out of left field, sort of random questions. And a lot of times they come from this chapter, where it'll be a question about one of the authors, or one of the religious societies and stuff like that. I try to just talk about the the societies, the authors, the religious figures that you see most often. But hopefully the questions will be about those. But just know that you need to read the chapter and you need to do the vocab and those study guides. And when it comes time to reviewing for the AP test, you really need to work on your beast, because the beast is going to give you all of this stuff, and hopefully it'll spark something in your memory when you're doing the multiple choice section. And if, for God's sakes, if you end up suffering through a DBQ from this time period, hopefully a name or some sort of vocab term or phrase will pop in your head that you can throw in there for outside information to score well in the DBQ as well.